tremendous advocacy. Yang Jianli, thank you for your decades of advocacy and very, very strong and insightful protection, assertions of human rights, which are guaranteed to everybody on the planet. Unfortunately, under Xi Jinping and his predecessors, that has not been the case. You know, I've been, as was mentioned, in Congress since 1980. When Ronald Reagan was elected, I was elected as well. And many of us had the highest hopes that communism, because it is so anti-human being, because it is so anti-human rights, would soon go to the dustbin of history. We saw it with the breakup of the Soviet Union, we saw it with the East Bloc countries, and China looked at that and said, not here, not anytime soon, and have doubled down on their repression ever since. You know, after Tiananmen Square, and Yang Jianli certainly knows because he suffered, as did so many, during the Tiananmen Square massacre and the roundups and the people who were thrown into prison. Our country, under successive presidents, in my opinion, have been weak, vacillating, sometimes rhetorical. They'll say something that sounds good. Bill Clinton, for example, called out George Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, and said that he had coddled dictatorship by not being forceful and strong post Tiananmen Square. I agreed with him. I'm a Republican, and said, you know, we've got to get this right. But unfortunately, Bill Clinton coddled like nobody has ever coddled ever. He linked human rights with trade in 1993. Many of us went to the floor of the House, held press conferences, and said, thank you, Mr. President, for doing so. And then 1 year later, and in the interim, I traveled to Beijing, as I had often done. I had a letter with 100 signers on it, including Speaker Pelosi, then just a member of Congress, but a very distinguished one, and presented it to the foreign ministry, and they basically laughed and said, one, it's sovereignty. You have nothing to say about it. That's what all human rights abusers do. That's what they used to say in South Africa during apartheid. That's what they used to say in the Soviet Union. All dictatorships say it's a matter of sovereignty, even though these are fundamental human rights that are universally protected by UN covenants and treaties and aspirations that come out of that body. So that was his first comment. His second was, the fix is already in. They being China, are going to get this very, very lucrative most favored nation status without any kind of linkage to human rights. We came back, contacted the White House. Warren Christopher was then the Secretary of State, and argued as passionately as I could that they think you're bluffing. Unfortunately, Bill Clinton was bluffing. On May 26, 1994, he took his executive order, which was really perfectly well written in terms of human rights benchmarks, and the operative phrase, what significant progress had to be made or else most favored nation status would have been gone. And you know, for an export-driven economy, that would have been catastrophic. So I believe, had we stood our ground, there would have been very, very serious reforms that would have come in the wake of the loss of MFN. I have with me today the transcript. I did a press conference about an hour after Clinton did this. It was late on a Friday afternoon after just about every House and Senate member had gone home. I was lingering, working, doing some paperwork when the news story broke. Rushed over and did a press conference on it, and it's here for your perusal. It was a complete capitulation. In my opinion, historically, that's when China took the measure of the United States and said all that they care about are profits, not human rights. Yes, rhetorically, they'll say they're for human rights, but they're not when really push comes to shove. And we've had successive presidents who, in like manner, have had the false narrative that if we just trade more, somehow this dictatorship will matriculate into a democracy, and as we've all seen, nothing could be further from the truth. Xi Jinping really is the embodiment of Mao Zedong. He espouses, he reveres him, and unfortunately pushes many of the same repressive measures, the endemic, pervasive use of torture, for example, which can be found everywhere against the religious community and against the political activists, democracy activists. Just a couple of things. I was happy when Secretary Pompeo raised the issue of religious freedom very aggressively at the 2 summits that were held during the summer months. That was a good move. And as the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I was very happy that China was put on Tier 3 egregious violator for labor and sex trafficking, which it is. We could not get that from the Obama administration. For the 1 year that they were on Tier 3, it was an automatic downgrade. Had nothing to do with a call, a courageous call being made by the White House and the State Department. So finally, at least that is being exposed. Now, fast forward to the Hong Kong issue. Scott Flipsy is here with us today. Back in 5 years ago, I introduced the first Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and Scott was instrumental in that legislation. It didn't pass. The same old crowd that said, oh, you will make matters worse if somehow you raise the issue of human rights in a way that is actionable. And again, this is our foreign policy now, U.S. foreign policy. We give Hong Kong very, very special. I mean, MFN is a goner, that's been gone for a lot of years, but in this case, we do give Hong Kong a tremendous number of benefits that are because it is different. You know, you look back at the solemn promises that were made by Beijing in the Sino-British 1984 statement. I went back and I reread that. It is very well written, and it commits, after the conveyance of Hong Kong back to China, it commits them, they being in Beijing, to respecting fundamental human rights and having a different system, a capitalist system in Hong Kong. Then you look at the Basic Law, which reads a whole lot like the Bill of Rights for the United States. It is very well written and, again, binds the Chinese government to respecting human rights and democracy. And that, too, in these recent years now, have begun the shredding of those very solemnly undertaken promises. So what do we do? Well, under the previous administration, we did nothing. I hope that this administration will sign this bill into law and be very firm. You have to be belligerent. Just be firm. Say, you know, Xi Jinping, you promised all of this. Your governments, previous, and now you're breaking that solemn oath by doing what you're doing in terms of taking the Basic Law and violating it, and it's en route to a massive violation over time. So much so that Hong Kong will be indistinguishable from any other city in mainland China. The legislation passed. It is totally bipartisan. Jim and I, as you know, he spoke earlier, he's the principal co-sponsor on my bill, and I'm the principal co-sponsor on his bill, the PROTECT Act, to ensure that U.S. corporations are not aiding and abetting the surveillance state and providing weapons, providing tear gas and everything else that is used to repress the wonderful people who have taken to the streets. We're not going to give up on this. The House has passed it. We're hoping the Senate will just put it up for a vote and pass it and send it down to the President. And I do believe when he is presented with this bill, he will sign it. And then that annual review, and it will be a quick review, start right away under Secretary Pompeo, will be to look at whether or not the Basic Law, whether or not the Sino-British Joint Declaration, whether or not the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is included in the bill, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether or not those 4 principles of bodies of commitments are being violated, and if they are, to take very decisive action to say we will no longer honor a special treatment of Hong Kong if indeed you have made these changes, which they have. Right now, it's a slam dunk as to what the determination will be. Our hope is that the government of China will revisit, that other voices perhaps other than Xi Jinping, and I think Carrie Lam is not the one calling the shots, it's coming right out of Beijing, will say enough is enough, we got to cease and desist on this. They did back off on the extradition, at least for now, and that was a warning shot across the bow of another escalation or another effort to undermine fundamental freedoms and human rights in Hong Kong. You've got it. One big takeaway. It is totally bipartisan. Yes, some of the business interests are weighing in against this, but frankly, ever since MFN was on the table as an issue, they have weighed in, and they were wrong. Again, their narrative is somehow, if you just trade more and provide unbelievable largesse to the People's Republic of China, somehow they will evolve into a human rights loving government, has been proven demonstrably false. The great experiment failed. So it's time to say, we're not going to let that happen again to another group of people, the 8 million wonderful people of Hong Kong. Thank you. Some of the people in this room have been, I've chaired a number of congressional hearings over the years, and Yang Jianli has been one of our greatest, and you've been great in terms of providing all the insights. One of the best witnesses that we have had over these many, many years, always coming up with very insightful, what are our next moves? What should we do? So I want to thank you for that.